I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where I speak with creative entrepreneurs, artists, and other insanely interesting people to hear their stories, learn about their molding moments, tipping points, and spectacular takeoffs.
Mike, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Hey, Srini, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So, I came across you by way of one of our listeners, and I absolutely was totally intrigued by your story. So tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and sort of the journey before the journey that people know you for today.
Yeah, well, like most people, especially a lot of the wonderful people you have here on your show, I've had quite an interesting sort of twist and turn and windy road, if you will. But my journey really started with baseball. So I played baseball all growing up from the time I started t-ball when I was 7 years old and decided very early on I wanted to play in the major leagues. That was my passion. That was my thing. And I was actually pretty good and, played through high school and actually got drafted right out of high school by the New York Yankees. I didn't end up signing a contract with the Yankees at that time because I got an opportunity to play baseball at Stanford. And if I'd signed with the Yankees right out of high school, then I could have still gone to Stanford and, to go to school, but I couldn't have played there. So I go to Stanford, play baseball there, and get drafted out of Stanford by the Kansas City Royals and sign my pro contract. And the way it works in baseball, you get drafted by a major league team. You still have to go into the minor leagues. There's a bunch of different levels, and you kind of got to work your way up. And I was left-handed pitcher doing pretty well in the minor leagues, working my way up. And unfortunately, my third season in the minors, I went out to pitch one night, and I threw one pitch, and I tore ligaments in my elbow, and I blew my arm out. So at 23 years old, after starting baseball at 7, my career ended. I didn't know that my career was over when I got hurt. I was playing on the East Coast at that time. I knew the season was over because I hurt myself pretty bad, and they sent me back to California where I grew up and still live now, and I ended up having an operation on my arm that summer. I had actually 3 operations over the next 2 years. And unfortunately, when all the surgeries were done and everything, I was almost 25 years old at that point. I wasn't able to come back and keep playing, so baseball ended, and I had to figure out what to do with the rest of my life, which, I had gone to Stanford, and I'd gotten a degree and all that, and I'd always thought I got to have a plan B, but I really had no plan B, so I didn't know what the hell I was going to do, quite frankly. And I was pretty devastated by the experience because it had been big, huge piece of my life, obviously, but it actually ended up being, as often is the case when something really difficult and tragic happens, it actually was a huge catalyst for me. I didn't know it at the time. I went into the .com world. It was the late 90s, and I got a job working for a startup in San Francisco, and it's based in New York, but the office I was working for was in San Francisco, and did some online ad sales for about a year and a half, and then went to another startup and was going to, get rich like everybody else because the company I went to work for was supposed to go public, but then the .com bubble burst and I lost my job. And so I was, in the middle of 2000, I was 26, I guess, going on 27, and someone asked me, a mentor of mine asked me, what do you really want to do? And, if money weren't an issue, what would you do? And I said, well, what I'd do, if I could do anything, really, is I would write and I would speak and I would try to inspire people. And I don't, and he's like, well, you seem really, and I was passionate, I was excited. One of my secret fantasies really had been if I had made it to the big leagues. And, the baseball thing was fun to me, and I was excited about it. But I hoped that by being an athlete, maybe I could use that platform to make a difference and to inspire, kids. And I don't know who. I wanted to be out there in the world trying to help people, if you will. And so I told this mentor of mine that, and he said, well, great. Why don't you go do that now? And I said, well, because, I'm 26 years old, and I don't know how you start doing that, and how do you get anyone to pay you to do that? Like, that seems crazy, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, well, yeah, you could wait till you think you figured it out or think you have some experience to talk about or whatever, or you could just do it now. And so that's what actually got me, it wasn't like that instant, but over the next 6 months, I ended up meeting my now wife around that same time that fall, and she really encouraged me, and I started my business as a speaker and a coach, and hoping to one day be able to write and publish a book or maybe more than one book. But that's at the beginning of 2001, I decided I was going to start this business and see if I could actually get it off the ground. And 13 and a half years later, as I seriously but jokingly say to people, I figured I'd give myself a year, and if I couldn't make it work, I'd go get a job. And I haven't had to go get a job over the last 13 and a half years because I've been able to write a few books and travel around the country and speak about, some things that I think are important. So that's kind of how I ended up here, if you will, and having this conversation with you.
Mm-hmm. So, I want to take a few steps back, actually, to the very beginning of this. You played baseball from the time you were 7, and you got drafted by the Yankees out of high school.
Yes.
One of the things I want to talk about is sort of really, really big goals, because, that's not a small accomplishment. That's a big accomplishment. The kinds of things that I think are out of the sort of realm of reality for most people. Like, I would never think, okay, I've got the potential inside of me to one day get drafted by the Yankees. I'm Indian. I'm not genetically predisposed for anything athletic. But what I'm really curious about is sort of two things around this. Sort of the mindset that you approach something like that with, and how you cultivated it at such an early age to think, okay, I've got it in me to play for the Yankees someday or become a professional baseball player. Right. And then, of course, lessons from the field that you've brought with you into life and into the world.
Well, those are two great questions. I think, I don't really know where that came from, quite frankly. I grew up, my parents split up when I was 3, and my dad, so I was raised by a single mom. I have an older sister. And, we had some challenges. From the age of 3 to 7, I did the kind of every other weekend with my dad. And my dad was in radio and television, actually, really creative, very charismatic, talented guy. But he had bipolar disorder. So he struggled significantly with his own demons. Now, I didn't know what that meant as a kid. But by the time I turned 7, he actually ended up in a serious depression, lost his job. And that went on for like 5 or 6 years. He was in and out of halfway houses. And right around that time, so around 7 years old, when my dad gets really sick, baseball was this thing I liked and was starting to play, but I was really good at. And I kind of knew that right away, and I got a lot of feedback. So I think that part of it on a psychological level for me was, this is something that I could be good at. This is something that I could get attention for. And in a lot of ways, it saved me from some of the pain that I didn't know how to deal with as a kid and what was going on in my family. And once I, kind of got into it and saw I was good, my personality is such that I just kind of like to, as my wife often says, you don't do things halfway. It's like, so I remember literally being like 7, almost 8 years old and asking my mother, Mom, what's the best college in the country? I don't know why I asked her, but she said, well, Harvard would be the best school. My mom's from the East Coast, and she's right. Harvard's Ivy League school. And I said, great, I'm going to go to Harvard, and I'm going to play baseball. And that was kind of this, I made up this goal at 7, almost 8 years old. And I remember then being on the schoolyard telling kids, I'm going to go to Harvard and play baseball. And some kid says to me, well, Harvard doesn't have a very good baseball team. Really? What? And I'm upset, so I go back home and I say to my Mom, some kid told me Harvard's baseball team isn't that good. And she said, well, yeah, that's probably true. I don't know. The Ivy League's not really known for its sports. And I said, well, what's the best school in the country that has a good baseball team? And she said, well, probably Stanford. It's not that far. It's about an hour from here where we live. I grew up in Oakland. And I said, okay, then I'm going to go to Stanford and I'm going to play baseball. And again, I remember vividly having that thought. I'm not sure exactly where that came from, but it just became this thing that, like, that's what I want to do. And it was this, like, if I'm going to do it, I might as well try to do it as big and as successful as possible. Now, the thing is, I would say about that, though, I think that there's some potentially dangerous aspects of that, if you will, because I've seen it in my own life, and I also see it in our culture as a whole now, especially, that this idea that it's all about, the sort of brass ring and the cream of the crop, and we have to, and look, you've probably experienced this. I know I have. Almost everyone listening. We have a big goal, whatever it is, we go for it. Even if we achieve it sometimes, it's disappointing because it never fulfills us in the way that we think, and oftentimes we don't, and then we feel like losers because we weren't able to make it to whatever we think we're supposed to. So, there's a lot of psychology, I think, for me personally underneath that, and some of it I think can be really positive in our desire to think big, but I also think there's some really dark sides to it as well that we got to be careful about.
Well, I do actually want to spend some time talking about the dark sides of it, and I think that's what we'll spend the rest of our conversation talking about, given the subject matter of your book. Yeah. There's another thing that I think is really interesting here when you tell me your story, is this idea of injury and how it basically, put an end to your career at a fairly early age. And, one of the things that I see with people here often is that some sort of loss seems to be a pretty common part of the story of almost anybody who's been on the show, or some sort of really just traumatic event. And I think that, for somebody like you, I can't imagine that didn't create this huge sort of loss of identity, because it's something that's just, it kind of defined who you are for such a long time. So I'm curious, in those situations, first, let's talk about how you overcome that sort of a loss of identity when something has been such a significant part of your life. From age 7 to 23, that's substantial.
Yeah. Well, and by the time I finally retired and was done, I was almost 25. So, for 18 of the first 25 years of my life, that was a huge piece of not only what I did, but as I got good, and I was good kind of right away. So I was like Mike, the baseball player. And it's interesting. On the one hand, on this sort of superficial level, not even so superficial, it was devastating. It was devastating to my identity. It was devastating to my ego. It was like, oh my gosh, who am I without this? But there was a piece of it underneath that I don't know that I fully appreciated at the time. And now, 15 years later, at the age of 40, I can look back and say, oh, it was actually kind of liberating too, because I had been so defined by that. But I think what happens to us, and look, and this is emblematic all throughout our culture, is that we get defined by the things that we do. And if we're really good at something, it can sort of be a blessing and a curse, because then it becomes, oh, he's really good at this, she's really good at that. And something like sports, or something like, in certain aspects of the arts, and this as a creative person and all the different creative people that you talk to, if it's something that's glorified by our culture, like, are you kidding? There's nothing more American than baseball, right? I was going to go be a baseball star, right, and go play for the Yankees or whatever. It was like a lot of projection that came onto me. Again, I wasn't fully aware of it, but as a kid who was insecure and sensitive and going through a lot of what I had gone through, growing up with my family situation, this was, for me, it was more than just about baseball. It was like I wanted to be somebody, and I wanted people to like me and approve of me, which I think, most of us do to some degree. So it wasn't simply just the loss of my identity. It was like, oh no, this is the one thing that made me special and made people pay attention to me. Mm-hmm. But I think, though, there's a story that I share in the book, and that actually happened when I was in college, before I ended up with my career over. And it was enlightening for me at that time, because my freshman year at Stanford, I actually didn't play. I had a minor injury to my arm before the major one happened a few years later, and I missed the whole season. And at the end of the year, and it was very difficult for me, and I wasn't sure if I was going to get to play again. And so I was having a big identity crisis at that time, because my future was uncertain as it related to baseball. But I got in a really serious accident at the end of that year that I ended up in the hospital. I broke my back, I broke my pelvis, I broke my wrist, and it was pretty scary. But as I was in the hospital, a bunch of my classmates, kids from my dorm and other kids from school, were coming to visit me. And there was this outpouring of love and appreciation and concern for me. And I was really touched by it, even in the midst of feeling really scared about the accident and everything that happened, as well as, what was going to happen, how would I recover from the accident, and would I be able to play baseball again with my arm and the whole bit. But I remember thinking at 19, I was like, wow, most of these kids that I knew from Stanford had never seen me play baseball, because I hadn't played that whole freshman year. Mm-hmm. But they seemed to like me anyway. And that was like an inkling of what I was then able to get more in spades, if you will, when my career finally ended, that, what? I don't want to live my life with all this pressure that I put on myself, that I have to perform in order for people to like me and approve of me. And that's, quite frankly, Srini, that's a journey that I continue to be on at this stage in my life, but it continues to get better. Mm-hmm. But I think part of that, yes, it was hard to lose that piece of my identity, but ultimately, and back, I think, even to the preface of your question, I think it forced me to look more deeply within myself, when a lot of very successful and creative and interesting people in the world have gone through some serious pain and difficulty, because I think it forces us to look at ourselves and look at life in a different way.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this. I'm going to ask you a question that I've asked a lot of people about pain and difficulty. And, it's something that I've asked this probably a dozen times in interviews, only because I'm so curious about it. Yeah, for you, this became a catalyst, right?
Yes.
And Sean Acor talks about this. He said some people experience post-traumatic growth and other people experience post-traumatic stress. I'm curious, as somebody who has experienced post-traumatic growth, what is it that differentiates those two people?
That's a great question. I think it's really intention, and I also think it's there's a part of it that's for me at least, self-preservation. I mean, here's what I saw, or what I sensed, even as young as I was. I saw myself at like 55 or 60 years old, sitting at the end of a bar, drunk, miserable, talking about how I could have been somebody. I used to be so great. I mean, I saw that, and it scared me. I thought about my father, who, although wasn't an athlete, spent a lot of his life. My dad died at the age of 68 when I was 27 years old, and my dad was this really creative, really talented, charismatic guy who just couldn't get out of his own way. And I remember thinking to myself, I was upset, I was disappointed, I was heartbroken in many ways, but I'm like, you know what? I'm not giving my life away to this. This sucks. This isn't what I wanted. This doesn't seem fair. I don't understand it. But it was kind of like a choice on my part. And it wasn't that it wasn't hard and painful, and at times it was. And look, it's not like even in my life right now at 40 years old, I will every now and again, not that often anymore, I'll have a dream that I'm still playing baseball. And it'll be so vivid and so intense, and I'll wake up in the morning with this mix of emotion, kind of like, oh, that was a trip, or like, I'll get so excited in the dream, like, oh, I got a chance to go play again. Like, it's still in there somewhere. That's still, right? So, it's not a black and white thing. And I think it's like dealing with the loss of any kind. Mm-hmm. I don't know that it's either all bad or all good. I think we choose what we're going to take from it. And I think my orientation in the world has always been, to some degree, and I'm not exactly sure where I even got this, is that I can not only handle what comes my way, but I can figure out how to turn it into something more positive. And it's now become more of a practice and something that I try to teach other people. Mm-hmm. But I think the difference has a lot to do with, again, our own internal conversation about ourselves and how we ultimately relate to ourselves and the things that happen. So it's not that I didn't have any PTSD from having that experience or from some other things that have happened in my life that have been traumatic. But I think that if we make a commitment to, I'm going to choose to have this be something that ultimately benefits me, I think that's the biggest differentiator.
Okay, awesome. So I think this makes a perfect setup to really get into the meat of what I want to spend the rest of our time talking about. You mentioned a couple of things. You talked about sort of having the intention to get something good from this. And, my friend Meg Warden even talks about this when she said, at her time in prison, she set the intention that something good would come from it. And now she's just this incredible person who really just brings a light to the world. Mm-hmm. And so you've talked about intention. You talked about cultivating a practice, and then, of course, sort of our own internal stories. So there's a lot of stuff here to really dig apart. Let's start with sort of changing the internal narratives so that we can set an intention and then develop a practice, and then we'll kind of tie that into the whole concept of self-compassion. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in what you just said and what you're alluding to, but I think, look, I mean, my belief is this, and this is why I wrote this new book, Nothing Changes Until You Do, is that I think most of the things that we do in life, Srini, are relatively easy. It's dealing with ourselves that's the hard part. Mm-hmm. And this was true for me as an athlete. All those years I'd go out to the pitcher's mound. Look, baseball is a hard enough game. There's a lot of skill involved. There's a lot of failure involved. But the hardest part of that game was not just standing on the mound dealing with myself when I was pitching. It was in between innings. It was after the game. It was all of the mental gymnastics and all of the beating up upon myself that I would do when I would fail. I think the same is true. I just got done writing this book. This was my third book. I had a huge breakthrough in the middle of writing this book. Because the first two times I wrote books, first book, Focus on the Good Stuff, was all about appreciation. Second book, Be Yourself, Everyone Else Has Already Taken, all about authenticity. Those were really, really hard for me to write and quite miserable experiences, quite frankly. I love the books. I did not like writing the books because I'm more of a speaker than I am a writer. Mm-hmm. That was kind of my story. And I kept saying, and I took 5 years in between book 2 and book 3. A lot of life things happened, a lot of stuff going on. But the main thing was like, I was scared to go write another book because I'd had such a traumatic experience, quite frankly, with the first 2 times. But in the middle of writing this third book, I realized this is really easy. What's hard is dealing with myself and all of my own fear and insecurity and self-judgment and constantly being in my head about, is this good? Is that good? Should I write this? Should I not write this? What are people going to think? All that nonsense. Look, the creative process, as you know, and talk to all kinds of fascinating people about. So back to your question about intention and creating a practice, I think one of the most important things for us to do in our creative endeavors and our relationships, anything that we do, is figure out how do we cultivate for ourselves a practice that's not perfect, that's not about getting us to some destination, but really does allow us to be kinder and gentler towards ourselves in an authentic way so that whatever we engage in doing, whatever we're trying to create, we can do it from that perspective because it makes us more open, more conducive to creativity, and it just makes whatever we're trying to accomplish that much easier. And then regardless of whatever practice, regardless of whatever skill or talent that we may have, look, if we come at it from a really self-critical perspective, not only is it not fun, it's damn near impossible to really do with any sense of fulfillment.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this in a bit more depth. As you can imagine, I'm not done. You've probably figured that out by now.
Yes.
So, I'd like to hear more about these ideas through the lens of some of your own stories in the last 13 years post-baseball.
Yeah.
Because you're right. I mean, I think we're all incredibly self-critical. When something bad happens, when we tend to blame ourselves. When something good happens, we're like, oh, that was just dumb luck. And I think that making that shift to getting to this place of self-compassion, it's almost easier said than done because, as we were talking about earlier, we live in sort of a brass ring, accomplishment-driven culture in which everybody's, highlights are on display in a way that they've never been before.
Yes.
And so I'm really curious, kind of one, through the lens of some of your own stories, where you've had to bring this practice of self-compassion in, and really, how do we put it into use in our lives on a day-to-day basis? I mean, that's really the gist of, how do we make that shift from self-blame to self-compassion?
Well, I think part of it is understanding a little bit, as simple of a concept as it is, I think understanding self-compassion at a deeper level. Because self-compassion, by the way, isn't self-esteem. And they're similar but different. Self-esteem is about sort of a global assessment of our relative worth and value. And the tricky part about self-esteem, while it's important, and look, the higher our self-esteem, the better we're going to feel about ourselves, the more confidence that we have. However, in today's world, where it can get dangerous is that we're constantly comparing and we're constantly focused on external feedback. We're constantly focused on accomplishment. How do I stack up to someone else? And that's why self-esteem can be tricky if we just go down that path. Self-compassion is about how do we relate to ourselves in the moment. Can we actually give ourselves that sense of kindness, that sense of compassion towards ourselves, which for many of us, as simple of a concept as it is, it's not easy to do at all. As my friend Robert Holden likes to say, there's no amount of self-improvement that can make up for a lack of self-acceptance. So we often even go at our own personal growth, our own self-improvement, which it can be a really positive thing from the perspective of like something's wrong with us, right? And I think, I remember a few years ago, a lot of times the way my own process works, and a lot of what I blog about or a lot of what I write about in my books or a lot of what I try to share when I'm speaking to groups of people is kind of the places where I bump my head into the wall, if you will, or realize something, even something subtle. But I was at an event with Louise Hay, who happens to be the founder of Hay House, who's the publisher of my new book. And she's been in, sort of the new thought, sort of personal growth world for many, many years, written a bunch of books. Her most famous is probably called You Can Heal Your Life, which is all about sort of kind of metaphysical connections between our bodies and, what shows up in our belief systems. Fascinating stuff. But I was at this event, and Louise was there. First time I ever got a chance to meet her. And she said this thing to me. The event was in San Francisco. It was ending on a Sunday. It had been a weekend event. And I'm talking to her, and I said, Louise, are you flying home tonight? And she lives in San Diego. And she says, oh, no, Mike. And I said, why not? And she said, well, I would never do that to myself. And I said, and it was just a simple comment, but I took a step back. Now, San Francisco and San Diego, it's about an hour and 20-minute flight. It's not that long, right? Mm-hmm. The event was ending at like 6 o'clock. And then she went on to talk about how important self-care is. And granted, Louise is now in her late 80s and very different place in life. But it actually had me stop, and I realized I've been priding myself on how much I can get done, how fast I can do things, how quick a turnaround. I can jump on an airplane and fly here and speak and then fly home. And it had me actually stop and pause and go, wait a minute. Just because I can doesn't necessarily mean that I should. Mm-hmm. And this was a few years back, and it actually has been a real shift in perspective for me over these last number of years, especially in the last couple. And my wife and I have 2 girls who are 8 and 5. I got a really busy life and a lot going on. I'm on the road speaking quite a bit. I got all this stuff going on, but really coming back to how do I genuinely take care of myself and do it from a place of compassion, even and especially when I find myself pushing too hard or doing things that I say I don't want to do anymore. And I think one of the biggest dangers that we run into these days with all the technology and everything that we've got at our disposal is that, how do we actually create some boundary, if you will, or some, break from it all, if you will, and do it in a way that actually serves us, not from a place of guilt and shame. I mean, we often do this with eating and with exercise and with, whoa, I should, and that we should all over ourselves, and then we end up stressed out whether we do or we don't. So a lot of my own self-compassion practice has been coming up with practices that I think are going to serve me in my life and in my work, and at the same time, holding myself accountable to them, yes, but then also having compassion for myself when I fail. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is one of the hardest ones for many of us who are committed to the work that we do, are committed to excellence. How do we treat ourselves when we fail, when we mess up, when we don't live up to the standard we've set for ourselves?
Mm-hmm. Upwork has the world's largest network of independent professionals. So if you need a UI designer,
hey guys, it's Kevin.
A full stack developer,
this is Madeline.
Or a whole team of designers and developers working together,
hey, you've got the full team here. Myself, Rachel, Adam, and Stephanie.
Hey-o.
Hey everyone.
Hey, how's it going? Hi. Upwork has agencies too, available for 6 weeks or 6 months. When you need in-demand talent on demand, Upwork is how.
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable.
So I want to talk about that in a bit more detail, but I want to go back to something else that you said. Mm-hmm. You said that most of us start this journey of self-help with this frame that something is wrong with us.
Yes.
Openly admit that has definitely been the default way in which all my self-improvement efforts have started.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that's the overwhelming majority of people.
Yep.
And I'm curious how we shift that so that these, improvements don't turn into trying to affirm our way or, psycho new age bullshit of like burning candles to try and make changes that are never going to happen through this mindset of something is wrong with us.
Well, I think, look, you're not alone, because that's what motivated me, and at times still does motivate me to make changes that I want to. But I think the distinction, look, whether it's self-improvement, self-help of any kind, there's a distinction between fixing and changing. So fixing, right, when we come at ourselves or our life or anything from the perspective of, I got to fix it, that means it's inherently broken. There's something wrong. Now, look, if something actually breaks, like you break your leg, go to the doctor, get it fixed, right? The window breaks in your house, get it fixed. There are times in life when, and even things with ourselves, like this is broken, my computer's broken, I got to get it fixed. When we're dealing with ourselves, and it's not just semantics, but there's a whole different paradigm of fixing versus changing. Changing is really about wanting something new, wanting something different, wanting to enhance something, wanting to expand or deepen something within ourselves. And so if we start to think about, well, why am I reading this book? Why am I trying to learn this? Why am I trying to improve this thing? Even like think about couples. We go to therapy. We go to sit down with someone. There's something wrong with the relationship. If that's the context, it's going to be difficult to find real healthy ways to change. Mm-hmm. So we got to shift the paradigm more from a place of change. My counselor, who I write quite a bit about in Nothing Changes Until You Do, is named Eleanor. And Eleanor and I have been working together for about 2.5 years. And she has been just like a godsend for me. And I've had a lot of therapy over the years. I've worked with lots of coaches and counselors and all kinds of therapists, you name it. I mean, I'm a big advocate in getting people outside of ourselves to give us feedback and guide us and teach us. And even though we may know a lot, it's always helpful to have someone or multiple people outside of ourselves that we trust. But Eleanor said this great thing to me recently. that I wrote about in the book, because she says it all the time, but the first time she said it, it just like kind of blew my mind. She said, look, here's how the change process works with anything. There's 4 steps to it. Recognize, acknowledge, forgive, and change. She said, recognize what you're doing. Recognize whatever it is that's not working, that's not fulfilling you, that you're not happy with, right? Recognize it. Take ownership for it. Then acknowledge. So recognize, right? Acknowledge the impact. What's the impact? Don't blame other people, right? That's the recognize piece. Take ownership, recognize, acknowledge. What's the impact? How is it negatively impacting you? Really feel that. Really take that in. Take responsibility for that. Then forgive. Forgive yourself for whatever it is that has continued to have you, right? Bring some sense of compassion. Bring that sense of forgiveness. And then she actually said, if you do those 3 things, if you genuinely and authentically recognize, acknowledge, and then forgive, the change will actually happen very organically, very naturally. You don't have to force it. She said, but what you do, Mike, and she said lots of people do this as well, is you recognize, acknowledge, punish, and repeat. And then the cycle continues, right? And that's what happens as we start on our growth path. We're aware enough to, oh, I'm doing this. Oh, I don't want to do that. Okay, yeah, there's a negative impact on me, or other people are telling me this is really irritating them. They don't like it. And then we get really hard on ourselves. You idiot. You stupid. What's wrong? You did all that negative self-talk. And then, okay, I'm going to punish myself, somehow thinking that's actually taking responsibility, which it's not. Then we end up repeating the cycle. And then we have more fodder for the ego to say, see, you're an idiot. You're a loser. You did it again. Right? This is why we keep repeating patterns in business, or we keep repeating patterns in relationships, and we can't quite figure out what the deal is. But part of it is we got to be able to bring that sense of forgiveness, that sense of compassion. I went up to Calistoga, which is a town up in Napa, about an hour from where I live in the Bay Area. This was at the end of 2011. And the year had been a very, very intense year. We lost our house. We ended up doing a short sale on our house because we got so far underwater on the house that was the way what we needed to do to get out. And we felt good about the process of doing it, but it had been very, very difficult and stressful. In addition to that, and way more stressful and painful than that, my mother had passed away. Mm-hmm. So 2011 had been a really, really painful year. But even with the pain of it, it felt like this huge shift had happened in my life. I could feel it internally. And I felt like myself and my wife, Michelle, we were starting to move in a more healthy, more positive direction with a lot of things that were important to us. Even though I was still grieving the loss of my mother and still dealing with some of the ego and other stuff related to the house situation, I go up to Calistoga and I spent the whole 3 days while I was up there writing in my journal and being in meditation and just being silent. I went up by myself, as I do sometimes, and it was all around forgiveness. Could I forgive myself for mistakes that I'd made, for things that I wish that had gone differently? And I didn't even know exactly how to do it. I had this audio that it was literally cassette tapes that I'd gotten in the 90s that I'd never listened to, that I still had my old Walkman, and for some reason, intuitively, I picked those up as I was leaving. I brought my little Walkman, my little cassette tapes, and I was listening to this audio program on forgiveness, self-forgiveness in particular. And I literally wrote down everything that I was upset with myself about, and it was holding against myself, and kept asking myself the question over the course of these 3 days in Calistoga, can I forgive myself? Can I forgive myself? Can I forgive myself? And what was amazing, it wasn't like some moment where all of a sudden everything changed, but just that process of doing that, I came home and I felt different. And the beginning of 2012, some really significant things in my life and my business started to shift. And as I looked back over the course of that year of 2012, I actually think that a big catalyst for some of those big changes that occurred was actually that process of self-forgiveness.
So a couple of things around this. I mean, you mentioned 2011, like losing the house, losing a mother.
Yep.
I think it takes us back to this whole idea. That's a lot of pain all at once.
It is.
And I mean, just speaking through personal experience of having, more pain than I could handle all at once and letting it kind of demolish me.
Yep.
You said that you could recognize that it was the start of a shift. And I realize that often it really is the start of a shift for
Yep.
most people, even though we can't see it. And I'm wondering how we navigate that time without letting it sort of destroy us.
Well, I think, as Michael Beckwith likes to say, and I totally agree with him, don't waste a good crisis. Like when you're in the midst of something really painful, trust that at some level, it was like what you mentioned your friend who was in prison said, trust that there's something good that's going to come from this, even if you can't see it, even if you don't know what it is. So you've got to have a certain amount of faith and trust. And trust, this is something else Eleanor's taught me that I think is really important. Trust is honestly expecting a positive outcome, not the positive outcome. Not I'm going to control it and it better go this way or I'm going to be pissed, but like honestly expecting a positive outcome. And in the face of pain, in the face of uncertainty, in the face of difficulty, we can't see that. We don't know what that positive outcome may be. And if anyone listening is anything like me, my natural orientation, even though it may sound like I'm this optimist, and my natural orientation right in the moment is to assume something terrible is going to happen. It's like in my DNA, part of how I was raised, part of how I'm wired up is that I naturally will go to the catastrophic worst case scenario. I've had to literally train myself not to do that because I know that that's not going to serve me. And so I think another thing that's really important is we got to have support outside of ourselves. I mean, without my friends that I really trust, I mean, like my inner circle friends, like the men in my men's group, like my wife, like the people that I can call the proverbial 3 o'clock in the morning phone call, those people on the short list of who we can bare our souls to, as well as professionals, again, be them therapists or coaches or whatever. Like I'm constantly and have been throughout the course of my life, which is part of what's helped me get through a lot of these difficult things, reaching out for support. And that's one of the pieces. Look, there's a chapter in Nothing Changes Until You Do where it's just called Ask for Help. One of my favorite questions, Srini, to ask a group of people as I travel around the country and speak to different groups at conferences or inside of organizations or all the different places that I speak, I love asking this question. I say, how many of you like helping other people, right? Who likes to help other people? Almost every room I'm in, it doesn't matter where I am in the world, everyone raises their hand, right? Because who doesn't like to help people? Now, some of us are busier than others and some of us are more selfless than others, clearly, but it's a natural human inclination to want to help people. Then I ask a second question. I say, how many of you love asking other people for help? On average, at most, about 10% of the hands will go up. And I often say, for those of you who just raised your hand, be very proud of yourself and help teach the rest of us how to do that more genuinely, more generously. Because the thing is, when we're unwilling to ask for help, which many of us are because we feel funny, it feels vulnerable, it feels weak, what if they say no, all the reasons that we don't ask for help. Not only do we not get the help that we need, but it's actually, in a weird way, quite selfish not to ask for help because there's a whole world of people around you that would love to help you if you would just ask them. And this could be whether we're working on a creative project, whether we're in the midst of a breakup, whether we're really scared about something, whatever it is. Maybe we're doing really well and we just need some help how to take it to the next level. But we need help. All of us need help. And so if we can get over our ego and our resistance, that's one of the most important things. Look, I would not have made it through some of the things I've made it through in my life without the support of the people around me. And I'm incredibly grateful to those people and to the people I know, the ones who are in my life currently and the ones I assume will show up in the future of my life when I really need help. And as a way, and it's never going to be a tit for tat thing. Like we can't always pay people back directly for the help. And if they give us authentic help, they're not really even looking for that. But what we can do is also open ourselves up to being available to help and support the people around us when they need it. And then it becomes a virtuous cycle.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things, other things you brought up a handful of times is ego, which I think, honestly, to me is often our downfall in many of these situations. And one of the things that really, I think ego may be one of the greatest sources of our pain. Because when you experience pain, I am realizing more and more as I've thought about it, is that what really is causing it is that the ego is getting just destroyed.
Yes. Yes.
And go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I would say another great quote from Michael Beckwith, who's the founder of the Agape International Spiritual Center down in LA, who I just adore. He said, remember that a bad day for the ego is a good day for the soul. And, that's actually one of the other chapters in Nothing Changes Until You Do. And I think that that's exactly what's happening is our ego's taking a hit. When painful things happen, it's so often the ego that's the problem. It's not really us, and if we can distinguish between our ego and who we really are and realize that, again, when something happens that is painful, when some rejection happens. Look, and this is so true, again, and you would know this as well or better than I do, given all the creative people that you talk to. Look, the hardest part of the creative process in anything we're attempting to create and put out there in the world is the fear of the rejection. And what's really at risk when we get rejected? It's our ego. One of my favorite TED Talks is by Elizabeth Gilbert, right, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, on creativity. I don't know if you've seen it or,
Definitely.
Yeah, and I watched that TED Talk I'm not kidding, like at least a dozen times when I was writing this most recent book, because she talks a lot about the creative process, and she talks a lot about, you know, that differentiation between sort of our gift, our talent, our genius, and that we get so attached to it. But really what I took from her TED Talk was that it is about something, it's like this energy that lives outside of us that we have access to and we can let it flow through us. That's what a lot of what creativity is. We get so attached to it like our identity. And the thing about it is that once we create something, whatever it is, however big or small it is, once we give birth to it, our job, I think, is to actually let it go. Put it out there in the world. Yes, we're passionate about it, but trust that, like, it's got a life of its own. You know, I've been playing around with this new book for me because I got my ego so attached to my first two books in a way that I could see now, especially looking back, wasn't healthy. And I love this new book that I wrote. I love all three of my books. I'm really proud of them. I'm grateful that I had the courage to do what I needed to do to put them out there in the world and get, it was something, I mean, if you told me 10 years ago I'd write 3 books and they'd be out in the world, I would say you're nuts. Like, I don't even know where that would come from. I had that as a goal, but one of the things I've been practicing is just really trying to let go and not have this book be about me. Mm-hmm. Even though, ironically, this book I wrote more about myself than than anything. You know, my friend Melanie, who actually was the one who listens to your podcast religiously and loves it and was the one who recommended it, she actually helped me and edited a lot of this book. And I kept asking her, Melanie, am I like, is this too self-absorbed? Am I talking about myself too much? It just feels like so, you know, because it was a lot of stories that are just all about me, but I was trying to make more universal points, and she kept coming back and saying, no, the more personal you get, the more universal it is, the more relevant it is. And she was so right. But I'm sharing all this because I realized that, look, this book as an example, and anything that we put out in the world, yes, it's a representation of us, but it's not who we are. And so if people like it, and say nice things about it, wonderful. If it resonates with them, fantastic. You know, just today, literally, I was looking online and there was a couple of negative reviews about my book. Uh-huh. And I had a moment when I first started to read them when I was like, oh, and I had that familiar feeling and like, oh, and like instinctively, here's what I wanted to do. I literally wanted to email like 5 or 6 people that I know really well and say, could you go on to Amazon and write something really positive because someone just wrote something really negative? Uh-huh. Like I had that instinct, right? And then I took a breath and I actually said to myself, literally, like, thank these people for saying what they say and allow this to be a practice for you not to get attached. Like, they can say whatever they want to say. They're entitled to that. Mm-hmm. Right? And I don't have to take that on. They get to have their opinion. They get to speak their opinion any way they want. And if they think that about my book, more power to them for putting that out on the internet. Right? It's a free world. People can say what they want. You know this, right? You're in this world that people get to say whatever they want to say.
Oh, yeah.
But what if we don't have to make that mean anything about ourselves? Or the positive one as well, right? Because that one we go, and then our ego can take that and go, look, I'm the greatest person in the world because people think this, or, you know, that's one of the dangers, I think, of our social media world, that we get so obsessed with how many likes do I have? How many shares do I have? How many downloads do I have? And that's all well and good to like track your business and to see how things are going if you happen to have a business that's focused on the internet to some degree. But that can be really dangerous territory when it comes to our ego.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. It's interesting because, you know, one of the things you brought up is sort of learning to separate ourselves from our ego. Easier said than done sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, are there practices that we can cultivate to keep doing that? I mean, on a day-to-day sort of practical basis. I mean, I've experienced the Amazon review you're talking about. I mean, I remember the first time I got a 2-star review. I mean, for me, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to put my energy into reading the 1-star and 2-star reviews. I'm like, what's the point? Right. They're entitled to their opinion, but it doesn't do anything for me. It just pisses me off. And, you know, I was like, okay, this is a waste of time. Yeah. You don't know, you know, it's funny. You could have 190 5-star reviews, and what do you notice? The 2-star reviews. Of course. I'd love to talk, you know, a bit more about separating ego from ourselves and maybe what we do, you know, how we can take self-compassion to really make that happen.
Yeah. Well, in terms of practices, I would say, I mean, the ones for me, and some of them, look, they're simple, but they're not always easy. It's like, you know, my meditation practice is one of the most important things in my life. And one of the big breakthroughs I had a few years ago for myself around meditating This is actually when I first started working with Eleanor. She was teaching me some meditations in our sessions, and she would say, I'd write these notes, and she's like, here's some sort of guided visualization practices you can do. And I said to her, I have a hard time with these. I've been trying off and on for years. I meditate, and then I don't, and then sometimes I'm not. And she said this thing to me. She said, well, what's the most comfortable way, easiest way for you to meditate? I said, well, it's actually laying down in bed, like in the morning, right? When I wake up, I go to the bathroom, come back. I'd love to meditate that way, but that always feels like cheating. That doesn't feel like real meditation, right? And she said, where'd you make that up? And I said, I can just meditate like laying in my bed in the morning. She said, if you want to. It's up to you. It's your life, right? Do it how you want to do it. For the last 2.5, going on 3 years, that's how I've been meditating. And I love it now. And it was that little simple shift for me personally, because I'd wasted a lot of time and energy for literally like 15 years judging myself for not meditating the right way, not knowing what I was doing. It didn't feel, I would go in and out of it. So just, again, make it work for you. But so meditation practice for me helps me get more in touch with me, not me like the ego me, but like something much bigger, something much deeper, something more universal about myself. I don't feel as attached to my physical reality when I meditate. For me, writing in my journal actually helps me process through things, but get more in touch with something that's important. And I have a separate journal that's just a gratitude journal. So as a practice, I write in my gratitude journal on a daily basis. Now, there are days I miss. I try not to be militant about it or get too hard on myself if I miss a day or two when I'm busy or I'm traveling. Mm-hmm. But those things, as well as we live somewhere in Marin County, a little north of San Francisco, where there's beautiful places to hike. And I've never been a real outdoorsy person, but just in the last year or two, I'm finding myself when I get out in nature, when I walk and just take a little hike, and there's a couple little trails near where I live, something changes inside of me. And so all of those things, as practices for me, help me get more in touch with what I think is more important than the little monkey mind ego that's constantly running all the time. And again, each of us are different, but I'm always encouraging people that I coach and people that I talk to and people that I work with, like, come up with a couple of core practices for yourself. And they may change over time, but what gets you more in touch with, like, what's real as opposed to a lot of the ego obsessions that a lot of us have.
Mm-hmm. So, I want to start wrapping things up here because I know we're getting close to about an hour. There's one last piece of this that really sort of intrigues me. We were talking a little bit earlier about our failures and our setbacks and the things that are really troubling for us, especially when things don't go the way we want them to, as people who are achievement oriented, as people who just, I think most of us have a very empowered view of our lives that we can control certain things, which there are a lot of things we don't control.
Right.
How do you bring compassion to the things in your past that have troubled you?
Well, I think the first piece is, it's that recognize, acknowledge, forgive, and change piece. But the forgiveness piece, I think, is really important. And I think, look, having a sense of compassion and forgiveness, and they're different, but they're sort of overlap and touch on one another, is think of it. Sometimes it's easier, I think, initially to think of someone or something outside of yourself. Most of us have the experience of being able to be compassionate and forgiving towards children or towards animals or towards, just think of someone. Imagine seeing someone in an airport or someone having a hard time. There are times when it's just very natural for us to show up in a very compassionate, empathetic, and forgiving way. Now, we don't often have that experience or have as much experience of doing that towards ourselves. But one of the things that I actually really like to do myself, and one of the sort of practices in my own meditation practice specifically, is I will go back meditatively, if you will, and have conversations with younger versions of myself. Because I believe that, look, that child that lives inside of us isn't like in the past, like back in, I was born in 1974. It's not like, I was 5 in 1979, and I was. But I actually think that 5-year-old, he's still alive in me sometimes. And there are times I can feel it, oh man, I feel like I'm 5, or I feel like I'm 15, or I feel like I'm 25. And in those moments, I actually believe that 5-year-old or that 15-year-old, that 25-year-old is sort of taking the keys to the bus of my life, and he's driving. And it's dangerous for all of us. So at some level, as corny as it may sound, and for some people this may really resonate, for others this might seem kind of odd, but can you go back, and if you're holding on to something from the past that you're having a hard time letting go of, a regret that you have, a mistake that you made, something you wish you would have done differently, imagine, again, being sort of the wisest, most aware, enlightened version of yourself, talking to that younger version of yourself, even if it's only 6 months or a year ago, and with compassion. Because usually the intention or the motivation behind the mistake that we made or the thing that we, wish we would have done differently or whatever we've made, and there's real impact to some of the stuff that we've done. But can we release that? Can we forgive ourselves for that? And even if we're not willing to, a lot of times when I do forgiveness processes and workshops that I lead, I will say, can you declare a certain amount of forgiveness for this? And if not, can you at least declare a willingness? I'm willing to forgive myself for this, even if it's hard to let go of, because that's the first step, is just the willingness. Even if you don't know how am I going to let this go? How am I going to release the anger and the judgment and the frustration I have towards myself about this thing? Well, at least just start with a willingness. Mm-hmm. But if you're willing to go all the way there, just say it, write it down. Ask for whatever you believe in, whatever your spiritual orientation is, even if you don't have one at all. Ask for some power outside of yourself to help you forgive yourself. I often do that before I go to bed at night. I will make sort of requests or have intentions. I want to let go of this. I want to work through that and allow that whatever happens magically and miraculously during the sleeping time, that something will get worked out that I can't understand with my conscious mind.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, hey, Mike, this has been really, really, really insightful. And, like I said, once I heard your story, I knew I wanted to have you here because I felt that this was a really important subject that really does impact our work and our lives in so many ways as creative people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on. It's an honor.
Yeah. So I want to close with one final question. And this is something we close all our interviews with. Having been through the world and sort of navigated it the way you have and having your life experiences, what is it that you think makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Oh, I think what makes someone unmistakable is authenticity. Is just there's a sense, and it's not authenticity like the word. It's not authenticity like the concept. It's like authenticity like the real McCoy. Like you can tell. You can feel it. It's visceral. I don't even have to understand. Someone could speak a different language, have a different skill, be interested in stuff that doesn't even make sense to me. But there's an unmistakable quality that's visceral, that's palpable when you're around someone or something that has that real sense of authenticity. And it's a visceral experience. It's a in-the-moment experience, and it can't be replicated. It can't be copied because there's something unique about it that just you can feel it.
Awesome. Well, Mike, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and share some of your insights with our listeners here at The Unmistakable Creative. This has been really phenomenal.
Thanks, man.
And for those of you guys listening, we'll wrap the show with that.
You've been listening to the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. Visit our website at unmistakablecreative.com and get access to over 400 interviews in our archives.
Upwork has the world's largest network of independent professionals. Let me just close this real quick. So if you need a back-end developer, a UI designer, or a project manager for 6 days or 6 months, Upwork is how.
Hey, I have this room booked at noon?
I'm just wrapping up here. Upwork professionals have the flexibility and capability to work from anywhere.
Yeah, it's 12:01.
Okay, it's all yours. Which is nice if you're already low on conference rooms. Plus, they're proven, rated, and reviewed. When you need in-demand talent on demand, Upwork is how.